Those were really good questions, you guys. I'm also feeling pretty hopeful. Yeah.
How do you deal with the stress? Like, say you kind of plant these trees, and then there's like people, media and stuff. But how do you deal with the stress?
That's a really good question. Stress. Well, part of it is about trying to have a balance in your life so that you're not always working, that you have time to be thinking about other things and appreciating other things. I think everyone finds their own way to do that. For me, it's about hiking. I do a lot of hiking, and I spend a lot of time outdoors, and that just makes me feel better. It clears my head, and I do a lot of yoga. And I have kids, so boys. I play a lot of soccer.
Next question.
What event or person influenced you to become an environmentalist?
So the question was, who influenced me to become an environmentalist?
Or event.
Or event, okay. I think the person who influenced me most was reading stories about a woman named Lois Gibbs, who many years ago was concerned that in her community a lot of the children were getting sick. And she found out that it was because the area where she lived, Love Canal, was being poisoned. And so she stood up and created a campaign organizing her community to run a campaign against at the time, one of the most powerful corporations in North America, Union Carbide. And it was really hard for her, and she was very successful. She was a big inspiration for me. And then I think the other thing that inspired me was the forest here on Vancouver Island. I fell in love with the temperate rainforest, and I was really devastated to find out that our trees that are, can be up to 1,000 years old were being made into phone books and newspapers, and that's what motivated me to start working on environmental issues. Yeah.
How do you get attention from the media?
How do you get attention from the media? There's a lot of different ways to do that. Part of it is really, that environmental groups do, is releasing information that is newsworthy. So doing research and writing reports and then putting out a press release and telling the media about this research. Other ways are organizing protests like the one you heard about in Victoria, or organizing photo opportunities. So when I was first starting this work, I used to bring reporters to the rainforest and show them the clear cuts. More recently, I've been taking reporters to the Tarsands, or inviting media to come or politicians or celebrities. I did a lot of work in the past with some Hollywood celebrities to try and get them engaged in the issue so the media would be more engaged in the issue. So there's lots of different ways, and it's unlimited. It depends on how creative you can be to get attention. Yeah.
Like, I'm just a youth that lives out here in Victoria, and I just want to know how I can help from out here.
The really cool thing about being you is that you can be connected to thousands of people around the world in seconds. When I was growing up and when I first started this work, organizing meant seeing how many people you could literally get to come to a meeting, and then that's how you did outreach. And then we used fax machines. Do you guys even still have fax machines? I'm not sure you do.
Yeah.
We didn't have Facebook. We didn't have the internet even. We didn't even have cell phones when I started organizing. So it was a whole lot more difficult. So no matter where you are or how old you are, you can state your opinions. You can write a letter to your MLA or your member of parliament and tell them what you think. And that's going to have an impact. You can also organize other people to do it with you. So real engagement in issues requires organizing. And that means joining another group that's already doing it. You don't have to recreate the wheel. You don't have to create your own environmental group. You can join one that already exists. Or you can organize in your own school or your community. It's about creating events, encouraging other people to write letters with you. And most importantly, it's about focusing. Because the big mistake that most people make when they start working on an issue is thinking that they have to be a part of everything. They have to know everything about an issue. They have to work on all of it. And the most successful environmental campaigns focus on one aspect, one concern you have, and one specific project. And just organize around it and build from there. It's about focusing. Yeah?
How do you balance your environmental activism with your job? Like, how do you get in?
Well, I'm really lucky because my environmental activism is my job. So that means that I get to get up every day and think about these issues and try and figure out how I can affect them or how the organizations I'm working with can affect them. But I really chose to do that. I set out to do that. So when I went to school, I took environmental studies as my degrees. And so my master's degree is in environmental studies, and I specifically focused on politics and environmental science and trying to understand that connection and how that related to developing laws and policies. And so then once I graduated from university, I went out and met with and volunteered for a lot of environmental groups until I could get a job. So I really focused on doing that. Not everyone can, but it doesn't mean you can't engage. And I think what's really important is that you treat it like a job, even if it's not. Because the decisions that are made today affect what kind of world you're going to live in the future. So treating it like a job means making a decision to spend time on it every day, even if it's a half an hour after school.
Yeah. Sorry, that girl, blonde, go.
What challenges do you face in trying to convince those that oppose your views and beliefs?
I think the biggest challenge is about getting people to think past a short-term timeline. So right now, the debate about pipelines and about environmental assessments in the country, the federal government talks a lot about how the pipeline is in the national interest, how there are economic benefits from aggressively developing an oil economy. And that's not untrue. There are economic benefits. And we need to recognize that arguments on both sides have truths, and it's important to recognize that. But those economic benefits are very short term. So for a politician who is mostly thinking about what happens in the next 3 years, because they have an election in 3 years, very difficult for him and his government to think about what happens in the next 10 years or 20 years. So I think the biggest problem is getting people, politicians or corporations who are thinking about their next annual report, to think past the short term and the impacts they're having in the long term. Because one of the things you didn't talk about in the last round of questions is the alternatives to an oil-based economy. They're going to take a little bit longer to create. They may be more expensive today, but in the long run, they'll be cheaper. But often a politician or a CEO of a corporation, they're not really thinking about the long run. They're thinking about how much money can be created now because they're going to look better when they file their annual reports or they get into the next election. Yeah. Yeah.
How many environmentalists will lose their jobs if the pipeline leaks?
How many environmentalists will lose their jobs because we failed? I don't think I quite understand your question. Why do you think environmentalists would lose their jobs?
If the pipeline leaks, and then there's no, like, it will cause an effect to the environment?
Yeah, so the people then who lose their jobs, who are impacted by a leak, are the people whose jobs are dependent on a healthy environment. So that's people who are, who fish. It's people who run kayaking operations and tourism operations. It's people whose lives are dependent on the environment. So as Mike mentioned, there's about 45,000 people on the coast who it's estimated in a report their livelihood depends on a healthy environment on the coast. So all of those people would be affected if there was an oil spill.
Did facing criminal charges or a prison term ever dissuade you from continuing the environmental fight? Why or why not?
Yes, sure it did, because it's facing criminal charges, making a decision to do civil disobedience, to protest, to get arrested. Those aren't easy decisions, and they should be the last resort. There's a whole bunch of things that you can do instead. The first time that I was actually arrested off the side of the road for making speeches. And there were 1,000 people that had come to Clackwood Sound up near Tofino to stop the logging, to try and stop the logging. And 10,000 people, 1,000 people had been arrested. And so I got charged with 1,000 criminal charges because I was the primary organizer and spokesperson. So So it was a charge of aiding and abetting criminal offenses. We argued, my lawyers argued that you have a right to make speeches and that people who are making a decision to blockade are making their own decisions. And we won, that there was no legal basis for the decision, so that got thrown out of court. But in the 2 years that I faced those charges, 1,000 charges, and I was facing 6 years in jail, there was a lot of times where I thought about giving up, because it was really scary. No one wants to go to jail. I didn't, and I haven't in the many times since then, because I think this is really critical work. I think you're all living in a time where these issues are the most important issues you'll ever face. Because when I started doing this work, it really was about environmental issues. It was about whether or not you liked big trees or you cared about animals. And now that we face growing climate change and impacts on our economy as a result, these issues define what kind of world you're going to live in, what kind of economy you're going to have. And so I think I keep coming back to that, and what keeps me going is the fact that I think we're winning.
Yay. Winning.
Yeah.
What local steps can we take to make a change?
What local steps? I think the most important thing that you can do to make a change is to, first of all, increase your knowledge and awareness of the issues exactly like you're doing. Don't take anybody's word for granted. You need to really, explore the issues and think about what you believe and what's important to you. And then to engage in the issues with the people who could make the decisions. So that means writing or asking for a meeting with your member of parliament or your provincial legislative member or your mayor, and talking to them about the issues and asking them why they're not acting. A lot of times when we talk about environmental issues, we're told that the most important thing we can do is change what we buy. Buy ecologically responsible products, or recycle, or ride our bikes to school instead of taking a car. Those things are true. But the challenges that we face are so big today that we're not going to solve them by changing how we act in our own lifestyles. We're only going to solve them by having stronger laws. And we're only going to get stronger laws if the politicians hear from us and know that we want them. Yeah?
So why should we really care? And how will the Northern Gateway Pipeline affect us here in Victoria?
The only justification, the only way that it makes sense to do the Gateway Pipeline or the new Kinder Morgan pipeline that you may have heard, expansion through Vancouver, the idea is that we're going to dramatically increase how much oil we develop in the tar sands in Alberta, right? So the reason we want these pipelines is because they want to export more and more oil. And why you should care about that is because that will lead to an enormous toxic legacy that your generation is going to have to clean up. So right now, every day, we have 400 million liters of toxic water that is being pumped into unlined open-air pits in the center of Alberta. So there's 170 square kilometers now of toxic ponds in the center of Canada. It's the largest area of toxic effluent in the world. And that's a legacy that your generation will have to deal with. If we have an oil spill on the coast, or when there are oil pipeline leaks, because there will be, you can't have a bitumen pipeline that doesn't corrode, there will be leaks. When those leaks happen, you'll have to figure out how to clean them up. Because the companies only have a certain amount of liability. And as we've seen with other oil spills, when big spills happen, the companies eventually walk away. And it's the people that live here that have to deal with the mess and figure out how to clean it up. And so what's happening right now, what you should consider is that you have a choice. This country has a choice about what kind of economy that we want to create. Because I did my work internationally for the last couple of years in China and India and Europe. A lot of those countries are building renewable energy instead of building fossil fuel energy or increasing renewable energy. And Canada could do it as well. There are alternatives. Yes, efficiency and conservation is important, as Michael said, but now the technology exists today to build solar installations and wind installations that are so big they can provide enough energy. And if we start electrifying our ports and transport systems, electric cars and trains, we actually don't need oil. And that's what a lot of countries are starting to do around the world. Yeah.
But even if we did electrify or use solar power or wind power, we would still need polymer to make everything that we have today, like oil products or even batteries to harness energy.
That's right. Do you have a job?
No, I just really smart.
I know, that's why I was checking. So the question was, how can we replace oil? Even if we have renewable energy, there's still other uses of oil. You're entirely, such as polymers. You're entirely correct. So first of all, there is research now that's replacing a lot of the traditional uses of petrochemicals with more natural alternatives. One of the coolest pieces of research I've ever seen is here in BC by a company named Lignum, where they're breaking down the chemical components of tree fiber, and they're now making plastics. And so they're now selling chairs that are in airplanes. They look like plastic, but they're actually made out of trees. So there is new technology being brought onto the market every day, which makes it possible. But the biggest answer to your question is the honest answer is that we're likely not in our lifetimes going to entirely replace oil. But the models coming out of Harvard and the MIT Institute and many other very reputable institutes show that we can dramatically reduce our dependence on oil and replace it with renewable energy, and then use the oil for the things that are really critical that we can't find replacements for. And so one of the newest studies by the United Nations says that by 2050, we can be 90% free of using oil. So there will always be left a 10 or 20 to replace that 10 or 20%, but that shouldn't keep us from trying to replace the majority.